You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
That plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. If you wonder what anarchy is all about, it's about living in a society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, the Trumps, the Musks of the world? Very simply, inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Simple concepts that people have been struggling for, occasionally successfully, since time immemorial. So what we try to do on this program is not just about talking, it's not just about highlighting different things or giving you a different perspective on looking at what's happening in the world today. It's also about trying to encourage you to become involved in activities which challenge the dominant ideology we find ourselves under, that's just capitalism, private investment for private profit, and the inequalities that occur. So we arrange many activities we'll be doing over the next year. We encourage you to participate. Some are social, some are political, some are direct action. So that's what the program is about. It's not just about looking at things, it's about encouraging you to participate, because ultimately it's only through your participation that things will change. And every major step forward the human race has taken started with that first step. And each of us needs to take that first step if we want to be more than spectators, powerless spectators regarding our destiny. Now, I'm excited. Are you excited? I'm excited because Mr. Dutton and the Liberal Party have released their federal election slogan. I'm so excited because by May this year, and I assume it will be in May, the federal election will be called. And why am I excited? Because their slogan is, "Get Australia back on track." You like that? Get Australia back on track. Not that we have many railway lines in this country, but get Australia back on track. So as far as the Liberal National Party is concerned, all their supporters, and there's a growing number out there, Australia has been derailed by this very mildly reformist Albanese-led Labor government. That's right. Derailed. I'm trying to think of any major initiatives the Albanese-led Labor federal government has been involved in the last few years. It's difficult. So they think a mildly reformist Labor government has derailed us. Get Australia back on track. Well, at least it isn't make Australia great again, but I think that's been taken by some other character who's going to become president or is president of the US of A. So get Australia back on track. So what do they mean? What do they mean by getting Australia back on track? Do they mean that they will finally put the sword to what's left of the Australian trade union movement? Does it mean that individual contracts, not collective bargaining, will become the issue of the day? Does it mean that the petty crap that Dutton and some of his supporters go on about regarding First Nations people will, once again, like the Howard regime, become the order of the day? You see, Mr Dutton is emboldened by the referendum, the voice referendum, because he and his Liberal Party colleagues were instrumental in scuttling that referendum. And he understands that if he dog whistles to the sentiments in Australian society, that this will clear the pathway for the Liberal National Party to once again rule the roost. Does it mean getting Australia back on track that we will see another disgusting display in terms of dividing Australians on the basis of whether they're social security beneficiaries or not, as we saw during the reign of the Morrison government? Robo-debt. Let's not forget robo-debt, where over 400,000 Australians were illegally convicted of rorting the system. Does it mean getting Australia back on track, removing Parliament from the path of the corporate sector to continue to extend its power in our society, as we see every time a Liberal National Party government is in power? I mean, their motto is the same: get out of the way of business, remove regulations, continue corporatisation, continue privatisation. Does it mean that we will continue to go all the way with the war criminals in the Israeli government? Does it mean getting Australian back on track that we're going to, rattle the sabre, beat the drums of war as far as the Chinese government is concerned? Will we get back to those good old days? Does it mean getting Australia back on track? Does it mean continuing the misogynist and divisive policies that have always been part and parcel of Liberal Party policy? Because you see, the Liberal Party is not part of Menzies' Liberal Party. I mean, Robert Menzies, the late Robert Menzies, would have actually resigned from this Liberal Party. This Liberal Party has got nothing to do with liberalism, nothing to do with free speech, nothing to do with the autonomy of the individual, this Liberal Party is about using government power to restrict free speech, to restrict people protesting, to restrict people from collectively bargaining, to restrict people in a myriad of ways in order to maximise the power of those who pull their strings. So I'm quite concerned about this campaign to get Australia back on track, because we've been down this track for decades, and all this does is actually increase division in the community, increase hatred in the community, increase inequality in the community. That's what this government, potential Dutton-led Liberal National Party coalition is all about. So although I know a lot of people think that parliamentary elections, who listen to this program, are irrelevant, the fact is they are relevant because they can create, through their use of their legislative power, create conditions and situations which increase inequality and increase authoritarianism in our community. And that's why it's important that we use every mechanism at our disposal to resist this attempt to get Australia back on their track, not our track. So, what are you going to do for the next federal election? What am I going to do? What are you going to do? Are we going to sit back and just, talk about nothing in particular, cry, become internet warriors, keyboard warriors, liking this and hating that, getting involved in all these conversations that lead nowhere? Are we going to let them get Australia back on track? That old Australia that should have been buried decades ago? Or are we going to resist it? Now, obviously, some people will resist it through direct action. Other people will resist it by presenting an alternative vision in the federal election. Ultimately, the result which is reached and which group determines the future of this country and whether Australia gets back on Dutton's track, his one-way track, will ultimately depend on the amount of resistance we are actually able to put up. Now, I'm very interested in looking at blue ribbon Liberal seats. Let's not forget at the last federal election, the National Party actually increased its number of members in federal parliament. Now, obviously, a lot of people in regional Australia somehow think that the corporate-based and the corporate-supporting, corporate agribusiness party, that's the National Party, will look after their interests, especially many voters in Queensland and to a lesser degree in New South Wales. So let's think about it. Well, I'm thinking, and because I live in Victoria, I'm looking at the Flinders Electorate, a blue Liberal Party ribbon seat. I've been approached by a number of people from the Flinders Electorate to stand as a radical independent candidate, not because I would win, all right, but because to bring forward some ideas. Now, if you do live in that electorate and you are interested, we're having a meeting on the 29th of January, Wednesday the 29th of January at La Porquetta's in Frankston, starting at 6 p.m, dinner and meeting. Pay for your own food and drink. So let's see if there's any interest out there in resisting the Liberal National Party under Peter Dutton getting Australia back on track. Remember the good old days? Remember the days of the yellow peril? Remember the days of robo-debt? Remember the days when every initiative made by Indigenous Australians towards reconciliation and treaty was resisted tooth and nail? Remember the days of the Mabo decision in 1992 where we were told that indeed First Nations people would claim our backyard. That's if you own a backyard. Remember all that. Remember the misogyny, the inequality, the way people on social security benefits, especially people who are unemployed, disability support pensions, were treated by previous Liberal national governments. Remember the jingoism, the nationalism, the beating of the war drums. Well, if you want that for the next 3 years, sit back, sit in your armchair, be a keyboard warrior and see what happens. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. Moral equivalence. It's an interesting word, isn't it? I mean, morality doesn't mean anything in the 21st century, does it? You know, ethics, morality, they're for losers. Losers like you and me. Because there's no ethics or morality in a private investment for private profit-driven society. It's about making a buck at the end of the day, irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. But I am interested in the concept of a moral equivalent. What do I mean by this? Now, over the last week or two, or even a few months, there's been this hue and cry, both in the social media and the legacy media and in conversation, regarding Nazi graffiti, which has appeared on a few synagogues. Now, obviously, the people involved in this would be neo-Nazis, because anti-Semitism has always been the backbone of the neo-Nazi movement. It's obvious. And it has become an increasingly discussed event, which it should be. But at the same time, while we talk about graffiti on walls, and this is graffiti on walls, the fact is that tens of thousands of people in Gaza and the West Bank and southern Lebanon have died as a direct result of the carnage which continues, irrespective of whether there will be a ceasefire or not in the next few days. Let's not forget that over 70% of these people have been women and children. Let's not forget that we're talking about casualty tolls of up to 45,000. So moral equivalent. What is a moral equivalent? Is one life worth more than another? Why do we as a society tend to devalue, that's right, devalue the lives of so many people? When we equate criminality, war criminality, the activities of a war criminal, for which an arrest warrant has been issued, the Prime Minister of Israel and his former Defence Minister, we just accept it. There is no moral equivalent. There is no moral equivalent. And we see this not just in the terms of, the Gaza conflict, but we see it constantly in the way the government gelded Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and more importantly the corporate-owned media, and the private platforms which are owned by billionaires, somehow, or continuously, there is no moral equivalent. For example, obviously the fires in Los Angeles are serious. Obviously, some people have lost their lives. But it becomes the main, all-consuming type of event which we see in our mass media. The fact is, we're part of a world community, whether we like it or not. And there are moral equivalents. But when we raise graffiti on a wall on the same pedestal as the death of 46,000 people, 70% women and children, and the pitiful situations of people in Gaza, an area half the size of Melbourne, you begin to understand why so many people are angry. Because there is no moral equivalent, although we think there is. Let's move on regarding moral equivalence. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner. Now, it happened 183 years ago, and you say to me, Joe, what's the point? Why rehash this stuff, you know? Now, I'll give you the background. It's a very simple background. It is a story of genocide. When European colonisation began in Tasmania, I think it was about 1802 or 1803, when Collins, that's right, Mr. Collins, after which the main street in Melbourne is called Collins Street, was directed by the New South Wales governor to set up a colony, initially at Sorrento in Victoria, which failed, and then sent across to Tasmania to set up a colony to stop the French from annexing Tasmania and southern Victoria, right? What happened was there was a 30-year war between the original inhabitants and the colonial forces, which expanded quite rapidly through Tasmania. And at the end of this 30-year war, which ended at around 1832, we had 334 First Nations survivors from a population of around 20,000. So in 30 years, the First Nations people in Tasmania had been reduced to 334. Now, these 334, after 2 or 3 years, had all been collected by Mr. Robinson, who took them to Flinders Island on behalf of the Tasmanian authorities. And within 3 years, because of disease, the population had been reduced to 84. Now, Mr. Robinson and his supporters had made a packet. The governor of Tasmania congratulated him at the end of the 30-year war because within 12 months, real estate prices in Tasmania has doubled because no longer did they have to deal with the pesky problem of First Nations people. As I said, there are about 82 people left, 82 First Nations people left. Now, Mr. Robertson, understanding that he had a saleable commodity, offered his services to the New South Wales government to use his blacks, in inverted commas, to civilise the Victorian blacks. And although there was a lot of resistance from the New South Wales government, they have finally agreed that they would provide rations for 4 Tasmanian Aboriginal people to be brought across with Robinson, so he could set up a network of, communities, all right, what was being after the destruction of the Victorian First Nations people. Now, he was so full of himself, he brought across 17 of the 84 survivors to act as his personal service. After about 2 years, the New South Wales government got a little bit sick and tired of Robinson's antics and removed the rations from his charges. And they were left to their own devices. Now, 5 of them, of the original 17, and some had died by now, by 1839, 1840. 5 of them in 1841. Tunnerminnerwait from the west coast, Maulboyheenner from the Central Highlands, and 3 women. Planobina, Putirana, Truganini took to the bush in the Mornington Peninsula, using the trails that the Bunurong had developed over thousands of years, the local inhabitants, and began a campaign of resistance. Now, considering what they had experienced and what they had been through, this campaign of resistance was relatively tame. They would go up to a squatters' camp, order them out, take food and guns, burn down the shack or the house, and the squatters would return back to Melbourne. Within a few months, there was consternation in the colony of Melbourne. Police, troops were sent out, and eventually on the 20th of November 1841, the 5 renegades were arrested. Now, during this conflict, 2 sealers had been killed in the crossfire between the squatters and the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner group. Now, they were brought to trial just before Christmas Day in 1841. I think it was the 20th of December 1841, before Judge Willis, the first Supreme Court judge in Victoria. Well, it was actually New South Wales in those days, because Victoria didn't become an independent colony until 1851, so it was part of New South Wales. And despite the overwhelming evidence, and despite the jury asking the judge to exercise mercy because of their situation, Judge Willis, seeing this as an assault on the British Crown and colonisation, ordered them to be hung. The jury, to their credit, found the 3 women not guilty, and they were given back into the care of Mr. Augustus Robinson, and eventually sent back to Flinders Island. Now, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were hung on the 20th of January 1842. Now, most of the Aboriginal people who had lived in Victoria, over 100,000, had within 15 years of colonisation beginning been reduced to less than 2,000 people. And the main reason was they were considered to be vermin. That's right. That were inhibiting the expansion of the sheep and wool trade, which was fundamental to sending raw product back to the hellholes during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Now, within 15 years of Batman arriving, illegally, 700 squatters owned every inch of the Victorian countryside. So what had happened to these almost 98,000 people, or even, well, some died through disease, others died through poisoned flour, others died because they were hacked to death. But it all happened behind closed doors. And it happened behind closed doors, this systematic genocide. But the difference between the systematic genocide that was being carried out and the hanging of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner is Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were hung because they resisted the colonisation process, not in some disgusting backroom situation, but by the British Crown. And that's why their executions are so important, because it highlights how the colonisation process occurred. Now, in 2004, the Anarchist Media Institute began to have little ceremonies at what we believed were this execution site. In 2006, we opened up this particular struggle, and over the next 10 years we were involved in a struggle with the Melbourne City Council to erect a significant monument at the execution site, which they did erect in 2016. Now, the 20th of January since 2004, we've been holding commemorations beginning at midday. And this year is no difference. Janet Gulpin, Bunurong Elder, will be doing the Welcome to Country. We've got a list of speakers, but it's a two-part ceremony. The first part will be broadcast live on Community Radio 3CR. The second part, what happens is we walk to the Queen Victoria Markets, to the site we believe where their bodies are interned. The tragedy about this particular campaign is that we felt, the Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner Commemoration Committee believed, that our successful struggle would act as a template for other people to be involved in struggles to create monuments across this country to the frontier wars. Because a monument, unlike a virtual reminder, is a visible reminder. It's no accident that after World War I, that local communities got together and set up monuments to the 62,000 Australians who died in World War I across the nation. But how many monuments are there to the frontier wars in this society? Over 230 years after the colonisation began. It's one thing been involved in protests on Invasion Day, one day out of 365, 366 in a leap year. It's another thing working consistently with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups to actually establish monuments across this country to the frontier wars, because monuments highlight in a physical, not a virtual fashion, what occurred. And the actual process of creating that momentum to create a monument also helps to educate people about this country's history. So we commemorate and celebrate on the 20th of January. And if you are in Melbourne on that day, come along. It's a family-friendly affair. School holidays are still with us. It's a way that you can actually highlight to your children what this country's history is and how it needs to change. This is the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. If you need directions, just go to the Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner Facebook page, or you can actually go to the 3CR Facebook page. All right, how it works. Now, nature doesn't care. It doesn't care what Trump or Musk or you or I think or believe. It doesn't care. Nature is basically an equation. 1 + 1 = 2. 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3. So nature doesn't care. I can believe that climate change is a hoax, but it doesn't care. But there are consequences if you don't actually listen, see, smell the changes that are occurring. There are individual consequences, community consequences, national consequences, international consequences, global consequences. It doesn't care if the bulk of the Liberal National Party still believes that climate change or the climate emergency is some type of hoax and that we need to continue on this fossil fuel journey. It doesn't care. It doesn't have the capacity to care. It doesn't care what happens to the human race. And your cat doesn't care. It may care what happens to you, but not to the human race. And every plant and animal on this planet doesn't care. Because the only ones that can actually tackle this situation are us, the human beings on this planet. And if a significant proportion are not willing to make the changes that are required to decrease greenhouse emissions, well, nature will do what nature has to do. It's not going to change its way. It's not going to be swayed by rhetoric, religion, belief system. It'll just carry on. I mean, history is littered with examples of civilizations that have disappeared, some rapidly and some over hundreds of years, because of major changes to the climate, major changes to the landscape that civilizations haven't been able to deal with. And you can look at the ruins and shrug your shoulders and move on and not really understand what this has been all about. But ultimately, this is a human problem. We caused it. We have solutions. Now, obviously, science can create some stopgap solutions. And that's the key, stopgap for limited periods of time. See, nature doesn't care about sovereign borders. It doesn't care about the human race, killing each other. It just doesn't care. Only ones capable of making any change are us. So if Mr. Trump wants to continue on the fossil fuel journey, we'll all suffer. And if the rest of the world thinks that this is the way forward, we'll all suffer. And we will all have to bear those consequences. Because nature doesn't have that capacity to care. We're the only ones who have that capacity to care. And the thing about the human race is, there have been periods in the past where things have been exceptionally difficult. And we've survived because people have actually cared enough to take action to try to halt what's occurring, irrespective of the propaganda which is pushed out on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis regarding the fact that science is irrelevant that we don't have nothing to worry about, that it's all a hoax, and that maybe the Martians even caused it, who knows. Nature doesn't care. If we don't care, we are in. Well, maybe not me, because I'm an old bloke these days. Although when I first started on the Anarchist World This Week, 48 years ago, I was a bit younger. The fact is, nature doesn't care. And that's why an increasing number of younger people are beginning to understand that the situation they find themselves in is because of our inability, the older generation, to actually change things, because we have been blinded by the consumer goods we have been able to acquire as a result of the exploitation of nature. Blinded. Let's move on. I'm interested in algorithms, not logarithms, algorithms, algorithms. I want to talk about algorithms because a lot of people are a little bit confused about what an algorithm is. Now, an algorithm is nothing more than a series of instructions which have been created by a human being or created by artificial intelligence, which has been, created by a human being. It's a list of instructions. Now, currently, the great, promise that the internet would be this hugely egalitarian system that would make each and every one of us powerful with all this knowledge at our fingertips, right? It could have been, but it hasn't. It's become silos of hate. And anybody who's been following the fires in Los Angeles just needs to click on and see all the conspiracy theories that have become such a dominant feature of that particular disaster. And this is nothing new. Because the algorithms of hate have increased as the ownership of virtual platforms which have a global roaming capacity has increased. And why is it so, as Professor Julian Summer Miller used to say? Why is it so? Why is it so? Well, it's simple. In order to make a buck, and that's what this is all about. It's about making money, right? The virtual world has been successful in terms of marginalising the legacy media, which had a monopoly, and which continues in many regards to have a monopoly on the way people think. I mean, this is what this moral equivalent argument was all about, the way we approach things, right? Now, the algorithms of hate are designed, and they're designed, the algorithms of hate are designed in order for eyeballs to go to that particular site. So the more audacious, the bigger the lie, the more misinformation, the more disinformation, the more, atrocious, outlandish a site is, the more eyes are drawn to a site, the more money that can be made from advertising. Because ultimately, these virtual platforms are not about free speech because they're owned by individuals or corporations. It's not about free speech. It's not about dissemination of ideas. It's not about discussion. It's about drawing your eyeball to that particular site so you can be bombarded by advertisers who pay money to the platform, and the more eyeballs are drawn to that site, the more money is paid to that particular platform. That's the way it works. That's what the algorithms of hate are. So what you do is you create algorithms which are divisive, algorithms which make people angry, algorithms which, make the most outlandish statements, algorithms which anybody who owns that particular site can actually create. I mean, Mr. Musk is an expert at throwing out the one-liner so that people respond to him, respond to his platforms, and augment his fortune. So remember, if you do find yourself in one of these hate-filled silos, maybe it's time you looked at other alternatives. I mean, I can find anything I like. I can have my eyeball drawn to anything I like. I can be bombarded by the advertisements. And inadvertently, I am increasing their profits at the expense of myself and the community, because we are now the product. Listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Look, as I said before, there's a federal election coming up, and Mr. Dutton wants to put Australia back on track. So we do have things to look at, because obviously the federal government will be waiting for interest rates to drop, and I think that's an opportune time to go to the electorate and say, our policies are working, vote for us, vote for us. The reality is, what we're going to see is a concentration of ideas surrounding personalities. And what we've seen over the last 2.5 years is a concerted effort, especially by the Rupert-owned legacy media and the virtual platforms to a significant degree, to actually belittle any reformist efforts which have been made by the Labor Party. This doesn't mean I support the Labor Party or the Greens. What it means is they see any move to make reforms, to share power and hold wealth in common, they see this as a total challenge to their authority. And that's what it's about. It's about challenging the authority of those who make decisions. It's not just about those who are our parliamentary representatives. Because in 2025, because of the reach of the legacy media and the privately owned virtual platforms, we've now reached a situation where our parliamentary representatives are more frightened of them than us. Because with the click of a finger, they think they can actually change the debate. They can actually make graffiti the moral equivalent of the murder of 46,000 people. It's an equivalent. Click of a finger. They can actually destroy reputations. And that's why we find ourselves in 2025 facing the same problems we found ourselves facing 150 years ago. Inequalities in power and wealth. That's why we never seem, as a society, to be able to tackle the most pressing problems. For example, the dire state of public education in this country. The dire state because so many resources are funneled across to the private sector. But the private sector, the private education sector, is sacrosanct. Can't touch it. We look at the mining sector, the extraordinary profits that have been made by mining companies, many working within areas which are controlled by First Nations people, making extraordinary profits, not just at the expense of the First Nations people whose land they're mining on, but the expense of each and every other person in this country who's a wage earner or a small business person or on a social security benefit, with most of the profits going overseas or going to, investors. We never seem to be able to resolve the housing crisis, never seem to be able to resolve the problems of poverty in our midst. Old Hawkeye will be turning his grave. He was going to get rid of child poverty by 1990 and everybody laughed at him. Can be done. We have over 35,000 registered charities in this country which are trying to fill the gaps which government is not able to fill because we have allowed, as a people, the private sector to dominate every aspect of our existence to such a degree that competition is no longer a feature of this country. And you wonder why there's so much anger and a growing hatred, not directed at those who actually exercise power in this country, the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, but directed inwards, as if the social issues which occur in this country are our problem. We created them. The fact is, you can do all the therapy you like and take all the medications you like, but if you've got a reactive depression because of the situation you find yourself in, the way to resolve that is to resolve that situation. If you've got unemployment, if you've got poverty, if you've got people living day to day, if you've got increasing anxiety, you're not going to solve this by passing piddling pieces of legislation which actually criminalise activity or people's speech. You change it through major structural reform. And the 2025 election is going to be, if we don't change the direction, is going to be a little talk fest about nothing in particular and no real change in the future. You've been listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Don't forget the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner Commemoration, Monday coming, the 20th of January. See us there at midday. You're welcome. Everybody's welcome. Listen to the speakers and get involved in the walk. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interests, josephtoscano.nam. You can actually write me letters. I get them occasionally these days. Post Office Box 20 Parkville 3052. Anarchistmedia.org. You name it, we've got it. But the trouble is, as I keep telling you, it doesn't matter how much virtual exposure you have. What matters is that you stop being a keyboard warrior or an armchair critic. Get out there Even if you don't agree with one thing we say on this program, I am sure there are organisations out there which are involved in resistance to the dominant people who make the decisions in this country. Get involved, do something in 2025. If you don't, it'll be more of the same, another boring election and another boring 3 years where there will be minimal changes. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Thank you to Community Radio 3CR for broadcasting this program across through the Community Radio Network and around Australia. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au, 3cr.org.au.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
We know you love listening to 3CR, but we also know that many of you haven't downloaded the Community Radio Plus app yet.
The app lets you tune in anywhere and share the station with your friends.
So, show the love and share the love and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.